Alright, so in this lesson I want to talk about render shaders that are used for compositing. So if you open up the scene, render shaders begin, you're going to notice that we're back in this little sidewalk scene, and if you open up the hypershade, you can see that I've already set up a few shaders that we're going to be using, and I'll show you how to create these in a minute. But what I actually want to do is work side by side with Maya and After Effects. So here I've got Maya open, and I've also got After Effects open. So we're going to go ahead and work side by side and show you a little bit of workflow that I like to use. So we go into our render cam, and we've got the same angle. What I want to do is separate first into layers like we did before. So let's go ahead and go into our outliner. We'll go ahead and work with the afternoon shot. So let's go ahead and unhide that by pressing Shift H on that layer. So here you can see we've got our sunlight, our fill layer, and our bounce lights. So let's go ahead and separate these groups into render layers. So let's go ahead and select our sunlight, add it to its own layer. So now this is the sun. Let's go ahead and add this set to this layer as well. So let's add it to that one, and we'll do this 2 more times. So this will be our sun layer. Let's go ahead and do our this will be our sky layer. And then we'll go ahead and add just these 3 bounce lights. So this will be our bounce layer. Now you can do this however you want. I just like to group them up. You can group them up however you want. You can even do, you know, per bounce, create a layer per bounce and per fill light. But for this, I'm just going to go ahead and group those and create their own layers. So let's go ahead and start to render out these. So let's go ahead and start with our sun layer. Make sure that we're in Mental-Ray, everything's set up. Make sure we have a decent anti-aliasing settings so that we can have some nice edges. It's taking a while to load. So we can go ahead and increase that just by 1. So we'll get a little bit better samples. And let's go ahead and render this out. Alright, so I've go ahead and rendered out just the sun layer by itself. I'm going to go ahead and save this out. We'll go ahead and use PNGs again, just for testing purposes. And we're going to go ahead and save it on the desktop, and we'll call this set renders. Okay, and we'll call that sun layer. And I'm going to do the same thing for the other 2 layers. Alright, so I've gone ahead and saved out these 3 layers, and let's go ahead and After Effects, and we'll go ahead and load them up. So here's our 3. We've got our bounce, our sky, and our sun layer. So let's go ahead and just quickly combine the 2. So let's start with our sky layer. This is also referred to as an environment lighting. So I like to call it sky layer, but this could be an environment light. Then we'll go ahead and layer on top our sunlight, so we'll add that, and then our bounce light. So we'll go ahead and layer our bounce lighting. And there you go. You can see that how we have a little bit of control, just like before. Maybe I think it's okay for now. So alright, so now that we've got that set up, let's go ahead and talk about our shaders. So open up the hypershade, and you can see that I've got these shaders. We've got our Ambient Occlusion shader, our black hole material, our ZDepth material, and then we've got our RGB materials. So let's go ahead and start one at a time. We'll go ahead and do the Ambient Occlusion. So let's first put our set in its own layer, and we'll start with the Ambient Occlusion. So we'll call this the Ambient Occlusion layer. And we're going to go ahead and just make sure that you select everything and assign this Ambient Occlusion shader to. Oops. Oh, I saw this. There you go. So everything turns black, and it's got this material on it. So I'm going to go ahead and just show the input and output connections of this Ambient Occlusion shader. So how this works is you've got a surface shader, which is just a general Maya node right here. So we can go ahead and recreate this now. Surface shader, And then we've got a Maya Ambient Occlusion node. So we're gonna have to go into Mental Ray, Textures, and then Maya Ambient Occlusion. So, or Mental Images Ambient Occlusion. So we'll go ahead and put that right there. We'll select this, go into our attributes, and we're going to want to drop this into the color. So remember that the surface shader has no surface shading material or attributes, but this ambient occlusion will give it those attributes. So let's go ahead and select this, middle mouse, drag this node onto the out color. And you're going to see that it's got that connection. So that's basically it. It's a pretty simple shader to create. And it's different per software, obviously, but in Maya it's pretty simple. So I'm going to go and delete that since we already have ours set up, but that's how you set it up. Then we've got our attributes here. So this node has several attributes. So let's go ahead and just take a quick render and see what we get with the basic attributes. Alright, so once that's done rendering, you can see how this ambient occlusion shader works. It kind of creates a soft white skylight shadows over everything. But remember that we don't have any lights in this layer, so the shader is creating all these nice soft shadows on its own. And the way this shader works is that it'll select a point and emit rays out from every point. So if, for instance, underneath this rocket, it's going to emit rays in all directions, and if it hits a surface, then it knows that there's an object nearby, and it'll start to add in more darkness. So for this point right here, it's going to shoot out rays all over, and it's always going to hit something. So this is why this is pure black. Whereas something like over here, where the rays, one of the rays will go straight up, it's not going to hit anything, so it's going to be a little bit white, but it's also going to maybe hit this curb, and that's why it has a little bit of gray. So you can see that as we start to get closer and closer to the wall, these rays are going to start to hit this wall and other things, and this is why it gets darker towards this intersection of the wall and the sidewalk. So this is kind of how the shader works. It kind of fakes that ambient skylight look with a shader. So this is a good way to get a global illuminated rendered look without having to actually render out global illumination. So this is a very popular shader, and one to be sure that you use under certain situations. So as you can see, it's pretty grainy, and we may want to adjust that. So let's go ahead and select this node, go into our attributes, and that graininess has to do with our samples. So it's pretty low right now, 16. But first I want to adjust one other attribute, which is the max distance. So like I said, when a ray shoots out, it tries to look for any objects that it's going to hit. Right now it's set to 0, meaning that Maya is going to kind of automatically assume the distance that you need per point. But we want a little bit more control, and plus this method kind of slows down our render. So we want to kind of pick a value that we want those rays to reach. So let's go ahead and go into our perspective, and we'll turn on our grid. So if we kind of just imagine these grid units, let's say between this rocket and the ground, it'd be about 3 units, 3 to 5 units. So let's go ahead and go back into our render cam, and we'll start with 5 because we don't want those rays to go any further than about 5. So we'll start with that and take a render. Alright, so now that we've lowered that distance to 5, we're getting a much lighter render, but we still got that nice ambient lighting around, and you can see how it's not completely black under there. We don't want it to be completely black under there anyways, but we can also see all the detail that this shader pulls out. We got those nice nice cracks in there, and we just get a lot of nice shading throughout the whole render. We got all the details and stuff, so this is nice, and I think that we're going to go ahead and just stay with this. So we lost a lot of that graininess, but we still have some of that graininess, but I can increase this to 20 or 32 or 64. The higher you go, the more smooth that look is going to be, but the render time will go up. So right now we're at 46 seconds, and you got to remember that if you're doing animation, this is multiplied by the amount of frames you have. So I'm going to go ahead and actually, I think I will go up. I'll go up to 32 just for this, and we'll go ahead and compare the two, and we'll go ahead and save this out. So let's go ahead and render. Alright, so you can see that the render took about 30 seconds longer, but now we've got a really nice smooth gradient around everything. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and save this out as well, and we'll put that with the rest of the renders. And let me go ahead and save this image out, and we'll call this something simple, Ambient Occlusion layer. Right now I'm just using simple names. If you're in a big studio, you're going to have different render or naming conventions. But for now I'm just using simple names. Maya actually has a preset for this whole process that we did to creating this. Let's say we wanted to add a new object. If I were to create a polygon cube, you can see that this object is not have this shader applied to it. And let's say I'm adding a new object. I don't want to have to worry about assigning this new shader. What you can do is create an override and a new a material override. So we can do our ambient occlusion. So now with that layer override, anytime we add a new object, it's going to have that material in it. So let's go ahead and create a cube, and you can see that now that cube has that shader on it. But like I was saying, Maya actually has a preset for all of this, so I'll show you how to use that preset. So let's go ahead and create a new render layer, and we've got our default materials on here. If you right click on here, go to attributes, and you're going to see this presets button here. Now normally this presets for most objects in Maya, they don't have any presets, but for the render layer, Autodesk was actually kind enough to add some decent presets. So if we were to click the occlusion, it's going to go ahead and automatically, well, first it's going to create the shader, so it's going to create a new ambient occlusion shader right here. It's also going to do the layer override that we did, so it took care of the layer override. It's going to the layer material override. It's going to create another layer override for this layer. So it's going to say if you're in this layer, you have to use mental ray because this is a mental ray shader. It's going to create a few other layer overrides. It's also going to create a camera layer override, so our background will be white, so we don't have to worry about any kind of anti-aliasing problems because we're going to have white on white. So that's a nice preset, and that's an easy way to create this shader. If you don't want to have to combine those two nodes, just go ahead and do that preset, and that'll take care of everything for you. But I'm just going to go ahead and delete this layer because we've already got ours set up. So let's go ahead and remove these from the render thing, and we'll go ahead and move to the ZDepth shader. So how the ZDepth shader works is it basically calculates objects their distance from the camera, and it'll create a black and white render from that. So let me go ahead and show you how this works. We'll create a ZDepth layer. And we'll create a material override as well. So we'll go to overrides, new existing material override, ZDepth. So now that shader is applied to everything within this scene. Now you can also do the same thing. Well, let me show you how to create this. It's actually kind of complicated. You've got a set range, so it's going to try to calculate the distance from the camera for you. And then you got this sampler node and this multiply node. It gets pretty complicated how to create this. So you can also just do the attributes, presets, or oops, let's see. Attributes, presets, luminance depth. So if we do that, it's going to essentially do the same thing and create this node for us. So this is just an easy way to create this ZDepth node. Now by default, if you notice, if we go into the color, that this old min and old max have connections in them, and these are what drive the render shading. So if I go ahead and go into render cam and take a render, it's actually pretty quick. But you're going to see that it's completely white, and that's because our settings are a little bit off. So I'm going to go ahead and break these connections because by default Maya thinks that it knows how to calculate the distance, but it's usually not right. So we'll go ahead and leave the minimum at 0, and we'll put the max at 100 just to test. And we'll create another render. And it's still pretty white. It's still kind of blown out. So we're going to go ahead and start to dial down this this max. So let's go ahead and maybe 30 and take a render. And it's still blown out. Let me see if I'm using the right. Oh yeah, that's right, because now we're using this surface shader. So let's go ahead and adjust this one. Break these connections. We're just using a different shader. They're the same shader. I just created it twice, so now we're using this one. We'll come into here, and we'll go ahead and set that at 100 again. Take a render. So you can see kind of a faint gradation from the closest point to the furthest point. But if we start to dial that in, we're going to get some better results. So, and you can see how quick this render takes too. It's 4 seconds per frame. So this is a nice render to practice with. So I think that the further distance is good. Now we can start to kind of increase this minimum, which is the camera distance closest. So we're going to move that up. So I'll move that to 10, and it's going to start to kind of inch that whiteness kind of away from the camera. So what we're looking for is a nice gradation overall. So I think we're getting close. I'll put that to 30. And actually that's a little too much, so I'll put that at 40. And there we go. So I think that's a pretty good render. We got a lot of information from this render. We can see a lot of different things. So I'm going to show you how to go ahead and use this layer as well. So we'll call this our ZDepth layer. And now we're starting to add a little bit more renders to our scene. So let's go ahead and go back into After Effects and load these two scenes. We'll go to, or these two renders. So we'll go ahead and load our ZDepth and our Ambient Occlusion. So let's start with the Ambient Occlusion layer. Remember, this is just, it'll add some nice soft skylight or environment lighting. So we'll go ahead and, since we want the darkness to show up, whereas if we were to put add, it would add the white values to it, but we want to add just the dark values. So we'll go to multiply. So anything that has a value of 1 will stay the same, and anything that has a value of 0 or darkness, it'll start to pull that darkness out. So you can start to see, let me give us a little bit more view here. You can see how that ambient occlusion really pulls out all that detail and those edges, and it's a really nice pass to use, layer to use. And we can even kind of dial that, and that really grounds our objects and it gives us a nice sense of reality. We can even adjust the colors on this. So if I were to click this little button right here and isolate it, I can do a hue and saturation as well. Put that on our ambient occlusion layer. And if I were to colorize, now we can start to adjust these colors. So if I want to if I were to keep it at black, we want it to have a dirty look. So this can also be used as dirt. So we can add a little bit more color, an orangey color, and kind of give it just that kind of a dirty look. So remember, you can adjust this to anything you want, but for me, I think I want to add a little bit of color instead of adding darkness. So you can see how we're adding just some color in there into the edges. It's not black, it's orange. So that's nice. Now, next we'll move on to our ZDepth layer. So how do we use this layer? There's a couple ways, and there's a lot of information that we can use with this ZDepth layer. So let's just talk about that. There's two things you can, or there's a few things you can do with this layer. One, this layer is used to convert footage into stereoscopic. So this is they use this to kind of fake 3D glasses renderings, but we're not going to mess with that. But that's just one use. Another use is to fake depth of field. So now instead of having to calculate depth of field within Maya, we can do it in post. So I'll show you how to do that in After Effects. So we're going to go ahead and create an adjustment layer within this composition. Layer, new adjustment layer. and we're going to call this our depth of field, and this will be our depth of field. So the effect that you want to use is called the lens blur. So we'll put that on our depth of field, and it'll take a while to calculate. This is a more intense, computer intensive plugin, but you can see that now it starts to blur everything, but we haven't really plugged anything in. It's just blurring everything evenly, and inside this effect you'll see this depth map layer. So this ZDepth needs to be inside the comp, so we can just put it all the way at the bottom, and we can go ahead and just turn it off. And if we select that layer, go into our effects, now we can select that ZDepth layer. So give it a second to calculate, and you can see it's the settings aren't tuned yet, but you can see how this cup is in focus and back here is, or up here, it's out of focus. So now we can start to mess with these settings and give us a better depth of field. So what I want is, I want this rocket to be in focus and everything else to be out of focus. So let's go ahead and we're going to turn this on and isolate it, and we can say, I want this area to be white. So actually we can adjust the levels on our ZDepth pass. So I can actually come in and adjust the white levels. So if I want, I can kind of crunch these numbers. Remember that if it's in blackness, then it's out of focus. So let's go ahead and go into our effects, unisolate that, give it a second to load that depth of field, and you can see that we're going to have to invert it because the black is focused. So now if we invert that and change our, undo that, change our focal distance. So this goes from 0, which is black, to 255, which is white. So we want the white to be in focus, and we're going to just kind of just dip that down a little bit. Oh, and then we're going to have to turn that off. And I may have blurred it a little bit too much. So you can see how we're starting to, we've got a lot of focus up here and we're out of focus there. So you can see how this depth pass can quickly add a depth of field effect to our render. So what if I want the front to be blurred and the back to be blurred? Well, then we're gonna have to start the pre-comp. So if I go ahead and select this layer, press Control-Shift-C, and what that's gonna do is create a new composition inside our existing composition. And if I double click this, now we've got our ZDepth there. So I can go ahead and actually mess with the settings in here. So I think this level is actually carried over back here. So let me delete that. We'll come back into our layer with our composition with these two depth layers, and we're going to go ahead and start to adjust these settings. So if I were to bring the levels back in here, and remember that I want the rocket to be white and everything else to be black. So I can go ahead and start to mess with that. I can even bring that in, and we'll start to just kind of mess with these. Then I'm going to go ahead and turn that one off, turn this one on. We're going to do the same thing, except I'm going to invert it. So I'm going to put the levels on, and then I'm going to put an invert effect on this. So we'll put that before. And now we're going to adjust these levels. The same thing, but back. So right now we're working backwards. The rocket is in blackness. So if I turn this on and hit add, you can see that now the rocket's starting to become dark. So let's go ahead and keep adjusting our effects. And remember, this is all post work. We're just essentially faking this effect. So I might want to go. There we go. So now we've got, remember, you can see how we've got a little bit of color gradiness, and this is part of the problem with working in post, is that if you start to crunch these numbers too much, then you're going to get artifacts like this. So you're going to have to go back and forth, but for right now I think this is okay. So let's go ahead and go back into our layer, and hit invert since we now the rocket's in blackness. And you can see that we've got a subtle blur here and a subtle blur back here. So we can start to now dial that iris radius blur, which is the essential blur. And now you can see that the rocket's in focus and it's blurred down here and blurred back here. So you can use that depth map pretty nicely. Another way to use this depth map is depth. So if we use it as an atmospheric depth, if I were to put it right on top of everything, or I'll put it actually below the depth of field, and I'm gonna go ahead and turn off this because it's slowing down my computer, the render, and we'll go ahead and invert this as well, because remember the atmosphere, you can see atmosphere, so let's put it on the wrong one. Remember, you can see atmosphere, so let's go ahead and put another levels on this as well, and adjust, you know, how much atmosphere we would actually see in a shot like this, and it would be very subtle. So we're gonna put add, so now you can see, and we're just gonna dial it down a whole bunch, so just a tad. For this image, since we're so close, you wouldn't even see that atmosphere, but this is how you would do that. I would even go even less than that. But for a render where you've got a very far off objects, this is how you would replicate that atmospheric effect. So let's go ahead and go back into Maya. Now, what's next? We've got our RGB shaders. So I'm going to go ahead and hide those and bring in our red, blue, and green shaders. So now what are these for? These are essentially just matting out objects. So if I were, let's say I wanted the rocket, let's say I wanted to adjust the colors on the rocket in After Effects. So I would assign it its own material. So actually I got to create a new render layer. So let's select the set and then create a new render layer. There we go. We can call this our RGB pass or layer. Alright, so let's select this rocket group and assign it a red shader. So now the surface shader is just pure red. That's all it is. There's no fancy tricks here. It's just a pure red shader. Now we're going to do the same thing with the set. We'll give this set a green color. What else we got? We'll go ahead and include those grass blades, just the green. And then our cups. Let's say we want to adjust our cups in post by themselves. We'll go ahead and assign material selection. So here we go. We've got our RGB pass, and you can have as many RGB passes as you want. You can have different objects within different layers. So for this instance, this is how I'm setting it up. So I'm going to go ahead and just take a quick render. Alright, so this is how our RGB layer comes, and let's go ahead and save this out. RGB layer. Now what does this do? It allows us to isolate certain objects in post-production. So let's go ahead and go to layer, new adjustment layer. So let's say I wanted to adjust the colors just on that rocket. Well, since I've already changed this, since I've already added the shaders to this rocket, we can go ahead and there's a certain effect here called, let me see if I could find it. Channels, and I believe it's set channels. So let's go ahead and put this set channels on here. Yeah, this is it. So let's go ahead and first bring in our RGB, put it inside our comp and turn it off. Go back to our adjustment layer, and then let's select the source. So we're going to want to choose that RGB layer, and the source red. Let's see, I think this is it. Or actually, yeah, it's not set channel, it's set matte. So let's set that. So now with this effect, we can choose our RGB layer, and then we'll choose the red. So now we're just affecting the rocket. So now I think we can turn off some of these settings too. yeah, so now we can add our own little effects, curves. And now we'll see how we can adjust just the rocket by itself. Now instead of doing it with an adjustment layer, I'm going to go ahead and just select these, press Ctrl X, because what that's doing is cutting out everything that we don't want. What we're going to want to do is first pre-comp all of our layers, and you can see how now we're starting to add more layers and effects that now we're starting to get into pre-comps, and it can get a little bit complicated. So go ahead and pre-comp that, and we'll just call this beauty, and then we'll paste those layers into it. So first we've got our beauty with our red channel. Let's go ahead and duplicate this and then change this to green. We can turn off that curve, we don't need that curves. And then we'll duplicate it one more time and change that to blue. So now we've essentially cut out the image and put it back together. But now each one of these is our own element. So we can call this cups. We got our set. And this is just another way to break away the image. And we're just basically cutting out the image. And this is a good way to matte an animation instead of having to go in and kind of roto it out. This is one way, so we can call this rocket. So this is just another technique, and this is how we can adjust objects individually. Let's go ahead and go into Maya again. And the last shader that I want to talk about is the black hole shader. So what this essentially does is kind of the inverse of what we just did. So the black hole material essentially creates, so if I were to assign it to that rocket and take a render, instead of, it looks like it's just black, but it's really cutting out the image, cutting out the object from the image. So it looks like the object is black, but if we check our alpha channel, it's not there. There's nothing there. So this shader has its uses, especially if you have, let's say, somebody walking in front of this rocket, then we would want to assign the black hole shader to that person, so that when we, let's say we wanted to render the rocket on its own layer by itself, then we can use that black hole shader to kind of cut out the person from the rocket's layer. So this has its uses as well. That's just one to keep in mind. But you can see that now, as we're starting to add more and more layers, we're getting more control over our image rather than just one flat image. We've got layers and layers to work with.